Hello there and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video, and it will be another video talking about the Nativity because it's that time of year, right? And goodness me, so a couple of my recent videos have been spammed by a particular reverend, interestingly, an ordained reverend who has been littering the threads with supposed refutations of my points. Of course they're not, and I want to start by looking at an epistemological method that apologists use. In fact, when I debated with Lydia McGrew about the Nativity on Unbelievable on the Premier Christian radio show last year, this was my main criticism, what she does. And as one of her acolytes, this particular commenter also does the same. And this is the fallacy of Possibiliter, Ergo, Probabiliter. What does that mean? It means it's possible, therefore it's probable. So what you do is you present an apology for, or some supposed explanation for the data. So the data is contradictory. Matthew and Luke contradict each other, and Luke makes problematic claims about the census of Quirinius. And rather than say, yes, these are fundamentally problematic, a bit like, Raymond Brown does in Birth of the Messiah, and says, okay, historically, I'm a biblical exegete and historian, but historically I can't justify what's going on here. So therefore something else is going on here, and it looks to be theological and not historical. And that's obviously what's going on. But for literalist apologists, they can't have that. So they have to be able to marry these two problems, or in this case, these two accounts, Matthew and Luke, and also harmonize Luke with history itself. Okay, so there's actually three things going on here. There's history, Matthew, and Luke. And all three need to be, for the biblical literalist, completely harmonized. So when they're not, they have to think, how could it be that these things can stand with each other in consonance? So how could it be that they work together? And they then start working backwards from what they see as a truth. They don't work towards a truth. They don't build up epistemologically from the bottom upwards. I keep banging on about this, but this was, my... I don't even know where it is at the moment. Oh, here it is. This is what I did in my last book, which is build up epistemologically from the bottom upwards, from ontology through to epistemology, through to natural theology, through to teleology, and through to morality at the end. Okay, so it's about building up towards the truth. What people like these apologists do is start with the truth, what they think is a truth, and then try and work backwards to maintain that initial starting point. It's presuppositional. So these guys are presuppositionalists without really calling themselves that. They don't like to say that, but that's what they're doing. They cannot have contradictions in the gospel accounts. It's impossible for that to be the case. So they have to do anything they can to stop there being contradiction. An example might be the census, right? The census of Quirinius happened in 6 CE that we know, and Herod died in 4 or 5 BCE. So that 10-11 year gap, how can that be? Well, it can't be a gap. So the census has to be at the time of Quirinius, the time of Herod and Quirinius. So what such apologists do is say, okay, how can this be? Well, we definitely know Quirinius had a census and ruled in 6 CE, right? Because there's uncontestable history to evidence that. So therefore, he has to have ruled earlier. And what they do is Possibiliter, Ergo, Probabiliter. So they say, right, conceptually, we can imagine a scenario whereby a human being can take on the same administrative role twice. Right? We can imagine that. It's not logically impossible that a human being can rule as a governor twice. And then they start with that and say, right, that's possible, therefore that's what happened. And it's possible, therefore it's probable. It's possible, therefore it literally happened. And they jump from a less than 1% probability to like a 95% probability. They jump from a conceptually possible to a it happened with some certitude. So it's like Quirinius ruled twice. even though we know from his known history of his life and biography of his life, he didn't rule twice. And you wouldn't have a governor ruling with Herod, and the client kingdom wouldn't have a Roman census, and a client kingdom wouldn't have etc., etc., etc. You know, or the rulers that were there, Roman rulers that were working alongside the Herod administration. We know who they are, right? And you can't fit Quirinius in there a second time. And so, and all these, you know, yada yada yada, etc., etc., etc. I'm not going to do a video on that, but my example is that they come up with what's conceptually possible without really looking at the evidence to say that's what happened, and then you try and mash the evidence together to fit that. And it's just the wrong way of doing history. It's a wrong way of doing epistemology. It's a wrong way of doing, you know, as I say, epistemology, knowledge. It's a wrong way of doing knowledge and truth. This is not how to do good academia to make robust and rational claims. It essentially is not good enough. It's just not good enough to go from infinitesimally probable as in incredibly improbable, and then using that as a wedge to then jump to that's what happened. So this commenter has done this all over the threads, right? And he does this. He said, you've made these really poor claims, which are actually really robust and highly probable claims, because we're dealing in probability. That's what history is. And he says, I've refuted it here. And he throws out an assertion which is entirely unevidenced. Here's an example. He says that the hometown of Joseph is actually Bethlehem. So when the gospel says he goes to his own town, the reason why he has to go to Bethlehem for a census, even though they appear to be living in Nazareth in Luke, is that he lives there and he's just visiting. He was doing some itinerant work in Sepphoris or something like that. He's literally said, there's no evidence for this anyway. It's not mentioned anywhere, but he's saying this is what could have happened. So therefore this is what happened. I've refuted your point because he was actually living in Bethlehem and he was doing some itinerant work up in Nazareth, and they went down for a census and then went back up to their own city of Nazareth. So it's because that's where he's moving now. And I'm going to analyse that in a little bit. But it's patently ridiculous. And the other thing he says, because I said, well, Mary, this is, who would take their betrothed, who's 8 to 9 months pregnant, on a donkey ride 80 miles to Bethlehem for a census they never needed to be at, right? And that is clearly nonsensical. And he goes, she was only 3 to 4 months pregnant. And actually, Luke nowhere says there's a donkey. And so she would have walked there 3 to 4 months. You can walk 80 miles easily, 3 to 4 months pregnant. And she would have gone there for the census, and then they would have done that. Then she had a baby down there, because that's what Luke says. And then they go back to Nazareth, their own city. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is like the worst apologetics I have literally ever come across, because there's no evidence for this at all, and it makes no sense. It's one of these examples where a Christian apologist will throw up a solution, a proposed solution, and not think it through, but that solution causes more problems for the overall narrative that they're trying to propose. The example is this. Mary is supposedly 3 to 4 months pregnant, but we know that they are going to a census in Bethlehem, and going to a census doesn't take 5 to 6 months. So if they're going to a census because that's where Joseph is supposedly from, again, there's no evidence for this, and we'll talk about that in a bit, and she goes down at 3 to 4 months pregnant because that's when this particular commenter thinks that I can just about get away with her moving 80 miles if she's 3 or 4 months pregnant. So he says, so therefore she's 3 or 4 months pregnant. She then walks down, gives birth to a baby, but she gives birth to a baby at the normal time. You know, there's nothing to suggest that in fact, in that time, if you'd given birth to a baby after 3 months, it wouldn't be viable and it wouldn't have succeeded. So she gave birth at 8 to 9 months pregnancy, right? So therefore, with this apologetic, the commenter still has to say they stayed in Bethlehem for 5 to 6 months. But let's look at what Luke actually says, because this is terminal. I mean, this kind of apologetic cannot work. Luke chapter 2, Jesus' birth in Bethlehem. Now in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken of all the inhabited earth. Problem, won't talk about that now. That kind of thing hasn't happened. It's hyperbole, it's not accurate, it's not true. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all the people were on their way to register for the census, each to his own city. This is key, right? His own city. So the apologist says, this reverend apologist says that he's going to Nazareth because it's his own city, as in he lives there. But no biblical exegete worth their salt thinks that this is what this means. And biblical commentaries don't do this. Anyone that reads it doesn't do this. It's not where he lives, but it calls him his own city. Now Joseph went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem. And this is the important part. It's a causal connective, because, so there's causation here. Why did he go to Bethlehem from Nazareth? Because he was of the house and family of David. That's what it means to say it's his own city. It doesn't mean he lives there. He is going there because he was of the house and family of David, in order to register along with Mary, who was betrothed to him and was pregnant. Okay, so we know she's pregnant here. What the apologist is trying to do, this right reverend apologist, is say that she's only 3 to 4 months pregnant. Okay, let's go with that. Let's go with that. See how we get on. While they were there, the time came for her to give birth. Okay, so 6 months has just elapsed, not while they were there. Like, when I say while they were there, so if I go to the shops, while I was there, I bought some sweets, a can of Coke. Okay, you could say while I was living in Gibraltar, so I was living there for 2.5 years, so that was an extended period. But when you're talking about going to register, we have a problem. So if you're going to Bethlehem in order to register, which is a very short process, and you say while they were there, this means while they were registering. And the reason I can be absolutely certain of this is as follows. So let me carry on. While they were there, the time came for her to give birth, and she gave birth to her firstborn son, and she wrapped him in cloths and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. This is the key point. So one, we know that they went there because he was of the house and lineage of David. 2, she gave birth while they were there doing the census. And 3, they couldn't find room at the inn, so she had to give birth to him in a manger. Now, if you were somewhere for 6 months, A, you wouldn't be staying in an inn for 6 months, and B, you wouldn't be living in a manger for 6 months. There is no way that you can read from that A, Joseph lived in Bethlehem, because if he lived there, what the heck is he doing trying to get into an inn, failing to get into an inn, and staying in a stable, in a manger, right? That makes no sense. So he doesn't come from Nazareth. He's from the lineage, which is why Luke goes to the lengths of providing a genealogy to show this, or supposedly show this. This is what the Christian apologist here is doing, is just butchering the text to get something out of it that he needs, but can't be extracted from it. That meaning cannot be taken from this text. He can't have been from Bethlehem, whilst also having to stay in a manger for 6 months until his betrothed gives birth, just while they were there for 6 months, while they were there doing a census that lasted 6 months, where he's not working. Apparently, according to this same apologist, he's not working because actually he's doing itinerant work up in Nazareth, in Sepphoris, for which he provides no evidence from Luke here. Absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Now let's deal with this donkey issue that this same reverend apologist thinks he's got me on. I say, who would take their betrothed, who's 8 months pregnant, 80 miles on a donkey to a census they would never be required to go to? He says, Luke doesn't mention the donkey. There is no donkey. Okay. By saying she rides on a donkey, I am referring back to a sort of cultural idea that isn't necessarily in Luke, and I'll grant him that. But in granting him that, it's hilarious. I am being charitable to say she's on a donkey, because what are the alternatives here, right? She is 8 months to 9 months pregnant, as I've just shown she must be. But even if you, like this man does, think that she's 3 to 4 months pregnant, the options of not being on a donkey are walking. She has to walk 80 miles, 3 to 4 months pregnant, or 8 to 9 months pregnant. Clearly 8 to 9 months pregnant. Who would ask their betrothed to walk 80 miles whilst that heavily pregnant? That's insane. So a donkey is a nicer, more charitable way of allowing some kind of realism here. Or she's on a cart. She's on a cart going on unmetalled roads that are bumpy, that are problematic from Nazareth to Jerusalem and then to Bethlehem, or bypassing Jerusalem and going straight to Bethlehem, is more problematic than a donkey. It will be more jolty. And, if you can afford a cart and either a donkey or a horse to pull it, I mean, that's even more than a donkey. These guys are supposed to be poor, although if you read Paul, he does mention that Jesus is rich. It's kind of weird. But you've got an even bigger problem trying to claim that they weren't on a donkey, that she wasn't on a donkey, because you have to say that she's on either on foot or on a cart, and both of them, I would argue, are more problematic than being on a donkey. So fair enough, she's not on a donkey. Your case is even harder to make. I will admit she wasn't necessarily on a donkey. Luke doesn't say she's on a donkey. But that makes matters worse for you, Reverend Apologist. What we have here is a clear butchering of the text to the point where some kind of supposedly coherent narrative is able to be intertwined between Luke and Matthew. But the problem is each proposed solution creates more problems. And each proposed solution is also the least probable explanation of events. The problem is the apologist, the literalist apologist here is duty bound, is shackled, enslaved to literalism, such that they cannot have any other explanation other than these two accounts cohere, and they can work in unity. So it means even if to do this I have to present solutions that are incredibly improbable, I have to do so. I'm duty bound to do so. So what someone like this Reverend does, and even Lydia McGrew, is they look at the suite of explanations of the data, and they are actually opting every single time for the least probable one. For every proposed solution to each of these contradictions and inconsistencies, the literalist apologist has to present the least probable explanation. Oh dear. And when you compound each of these explanations one on top of the other, you just get a flurry of miniature probabilities, such that this is just conceptually possible at a stretch, but it's not the most probable explanation of the data, and this is where the Bayesian analysis is important, to get some kind of understanding of what is the most probable hypothesis. That two people writing their narratives independently of each other, it seems, or one correcting the other, possibly, get some things wrong. Or do we just smash up history and you know, manipulate inductive reasoning in order to mold some like new narrative out of these two inconsistent narratives? If you're happy going through the day doing that, well, I'm not going to convince you otherwise. I mean, you're splurging my YouTube comment threads in a way that obviously shows that you have massive motivated reasoning for this. For me, if Luke and Matthew were consistent, so say Luke broadly told us the Matthean story, and they both claimed that Herod was involved and there was a star and blah blah blah, or Matthew presented the Lucan story and said there's a census, that wouldn't affect my atheism, because each of these claims are still not the most probable explanation of events. In other words, if it was just a Matthean narrative, that would fail a Bayesian probability analysis and evaluation of the competing hypotheses. Matthew is making stuff up is far more likely than that's what happened. The same with Luke. Okay, so I'm not hugely motivated in my reasoning to find inconsistencies between these two. There are just inconsistencies. There are contradictions, obvious, prima facie, and after thorough analysis, huge problems with trying to make these two marry. But for this commenter and for Lydia McGrew, the motivated reasoning is absolutely front and centre of what's going on here. Because if you admit that these two accounts are contradictory, then you are admitting that at least one of your four Gospels is prone to historical inaccuracies and to either lying or presenting propaganda or not being very good at deciphering what the truth is. And then it all starts falling apart like a house of cards. So I psychologically understand why this commentator is so defensive, and in being so defensive is so offensive and attacking on my threads, saying no, because he absolutely has to, because he realizes that his faith is on the line here, because his idea of faith is the inerrancy of the Gospels. And if you're going to start with that, if you're starting with your conclusion, no one can disabuse you of that faith. You are a presuppositionalist. Deal with it. And finally, I just want to bring in Raymond Brown here from The Birth of the Messiah. I'll make a couple of quotes from him because he summarises a lot of the work, a lot of the claims that these sort of apologists make. I won't give you all the places in the book that he essentially refutes all this nonsense, because there are quite a few different examples of this. But here, this is taken from page 668 in The Birth of the Messiah, Raymond Brown. So the journey, this is where he's doing a little bit of analysis of each verse as they come. So this is from Luke 2:3 onwards. So the journey to Bethlehem, the birth, and no room at the Capitolina. So 2:3-7. Caesar Augustus' census of the whole world, conducted when Quirinius was governor of Syria, is stated to have brought Joseph and Mary from Nazareth to Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. Once more, there are two historical problems. A, the explanation that each was to be inscribed in his own city is unsupported by Roman practice, page 396 above, and he goes into a lot of detail how that is the case. B, that Mary and Joseph lived in Nazareth before Jesus' birth conflicts with Matthew's evidence. As for A, Fitzmyer, Luke 1.405 confirms the absence of proof that in a Roman census people were expected to return to their native lands or their ancestral towns. Later Roman examples pertinent to people who had to go to be registered in a district different from the one in which they resided because they had property there continue to be cited, e.g. Marshall, Gospel 101, despite the very clear facts that Luke does not attribute the necessity to property but to lineage, does not use apotemesis, which is a proper term for registering goods or income, and refers to, quote, no place for them in the lodgings, discouraging the supposition that Joseph had property in Bethlehem. G. Deal Kilpatrick, in Luke, suggests that Luke may have got the idea from the instruction in Leviticus 25:10 that in the Jubilee year all were to return to their own property or family estate. As for B, above in Appendix 3, lest the issue get disproportionate emphasis by being treated in the body of the commentary, I studied the arguments for and against the historicity of locating Jesus' birth at Bethlehem, pointing out that the supporting evidence was weaker than for the Davidic descent. Some conservative reviewers have reacted indignantly as if Christian faith were under discussion, but Valori, in Natus, is willing to recognise less than absolute moral certainty. At least Matthew and Luke agree on Bethlehem as the birthplace, but they do not agree on where Mary and Joseph lived before the birth. Despite constantly renewed attempts at harmonisation, number 85 above, this is what, as a sidebar, this is exactly what I'm dealing with, these attempts at harmonisation. Absolutely nothing in the Matthean narrative would lead readers to think other than that Bethlehem was the original domicile of Joseph and Mary. Not only does Matthew 2:11 mention their house, of course the house isn't mentioned in Luke. They end up giving birth in a manger, but at an inn that has no room for them. I mean, come on. But also the tone of Matthew 2:22-23 shows that they were moving from Bethlehem to Nazareth for the first time. Luke's picture that Joseph and Mary had to go from Nazareth to Bethlehem for census purposes is often preferred on the grounds that Luke is more likely to be giving us a substantially factual account, a preference especially on the part of those who think Luke is translating Mary's memoirs. Yet there are those who hold that if birth at Bethlehem is historical, Matthew is more likely factual. Mary and Joseph were inhabitants of Bethlehem before Jesus' birth. That position would imply that the census was a Lucan construction based on confused memories of Roman censuses in order to explain the two fixed traditions that came to the evangelist, birth at Bethlehem and Nazareth as Jesus' hometown. This is so on the money. He goes on to talk about other things there, but that's just a great synopsis of what's going on here and the problems between Matthew and Luke and attempts in harmonising those very disparate accounts. Now I'm just going to look very quickly at the translation notes that Raymond Brown has of this section of Luke, pages 396 onwards, where he takes each verse or word and analyses them in some depth. So let's go back to each to his own city at the top of page 396. So while for Joseph, quote, his own city means his ancestral city of Bethlehem, Nazareth is designated as their own city in 239 in the sense of residence. So this is the only way of making sense of what Luke is doing here, because if, like my Christian commentator here, he says his own city means where he lives, then Luke is contradicting himself because he says their own city, which must also mean where they live. He can't live there and live there. The only way of making sense of this language is that, and we know this because he then says his own city because he's of the lineage of David, right? That's why it's his own city. It's not his own city because he lives there, because that makes no sense of using the causal language and saying he has to go there because he's of the lineage of David. And then later to say, oh, by the way, their own city is actually Nazareth, because you've just contradicted the fact that you just claimed his city was Bethlehem. So these are the absolute twists and mental contortions such apologists are getting themselves into to try and maintain that harmonisation. So in Roman censuses, there is no clear evidence of a practice of going to an ancestral city to be enrolled. The oft-cited examples from Egypt are not the same as what Luke describes. This is something I will take to task in the second part of my analysis of Lydia McGrew's video, because she does this as well. Do not use the Egyptian census. It is a total false analogy, but I'll talk about that again in another video. And then we talk about, I'm going to skip a little bit. From the city of Nazareth, the city where he and Mary lived, 239, a view that contrasts with the implication in Matthew 2:11 that they had their house in Bethlehem. Such a problem. And then we go down to because he was, the old Syriac Sinaiticus has because both, implying that Mary was a Davidide, so from the house of David. That's very clearly why he had to go to Nazareth. And then the next part, of the house and lineage of David. Here, as in 127, Luke makes reference to Joseph as a Davidide, a lineage affirmed elsewhere in the two genealogies of Jesus and in Matthew 1:20. Is there a difference between house, oikos, and lineage, patria? Some have taken oikos to mean that Joseph had a home in Bethlehem, or patria to mean that he had property there. Still another suggestion is that he was returning to his home in Bethlehem, his own city of verse 3. So this is what the commentator was trying to say, after having gone to Nazareth to claim Mary his bride who lived there. These suggestions run against the reference to Nazareth as their own city in 239 and against the indication in 2:7 that Joseph had no place to stay in Bethlehem. Thus we have no real parallel to the Kataoikian censuses in Egypt, where people were registered in the area where their home, oikia, or property was found. Luke refers to a census by ancestry. It is highly dubious that one can press Davidic lineage to mean direct royal lineage, or as Bornhauser has done when he argues that while all the Davidids did not have to go to Bethlehem, Joseph did because he was a royal scion. And this is something I talked about before, about there would be so many people trying to get to Bethlehem because they are from the house of David. There is nothing in Luke's narrative to suggest that. Okay, you don't want me repeating myself. I would just say that these kind of Christian apologetics and attempted solutions are absolute nonsense. They are just rubbish. Just rubbish. They don't entertain any kind of critical analysis or objective evaluation of the writing, of the data, and of history. It's just a single-minded attempt to harmonize that which appears unharmonizable. Yeah, I don't know. Just and the desperation is evident in the splurging my comments threads with these claims that just don't stand up to even the merest of scrutiny. This gentleman keeps saying that he's toppling all my arguments, and as I say, you couldn't topple a Jenga tower, mate. Like what the propositions here are amount to nothing more than pretty pathetic, obvious Christian apologetics that are unsustainable. Anyway, thank you. Question everything, particularly your own mind, yourself, and I'd say these Christian commenters and apologists could do with a little bit of that, questioning themselves. There's a whole lot of dogmatism in there, and of course I'll be saying, yeah, but you're being dogmatic yourself. Well, actually, I'm basing what I say on some pretty established exegesis. This isn't me just making up stuff to fit. This is me going through. I mean, I've written a book on this. I've given talks on this. I know a little bit about it, and I am pretty confident that my claims fit in line with most decent modern academia. So, there you go. Question everything, particularly yourselves.